Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to speak in this very interesting context. I want to divide my comments, my short comments, into two sections in a way, reacting to the notion of post-traumatic statehood, sovereignty, specifically through the lens of Israel, and then to say a few things about how the war in Ukraine is processed, or some comments about how it is understood or viewed in Israel, given this context of a post-traumatic sovereignty or statehood. And you have noticed already that I'm kind of stuttering between statehood and sovereignty, and I would say nation statehood or nation statism, because I think one obvious question to ask in the context of such construct of post-traumatic politics is who's the agent here? What the question of agency? Who is the traumatized? Who is to be erased? Who is that we need to fear for? And who's actually playing the dominant role here? So one way to understand sovereignty, I think, is that identification that the sovereign is able to make between itself, whatever it is right now, let's leave it for a second, and the people, which is not an obvious identification. And I think the East European case, without, with a thousand excuses and asking for forgiveness, but if I can go into, speaking about someone else's experiences, the traumas of having lost self-rule or self-regime, or of having lost statehood, is not necessarily the trauma of being collectively erased from the map, of dying. I can imagine other cases right now in world politics where the people look at their regime, who is the sovereign, and hoping for it to be erased from the map, for their own people's safety, for their own people's liberation. Right now, the question of sovereignty in this context is amplified to a very large degree in the case of Israel, because there has been an attempt at erasing the people before statehood, and statehood is to a large extent, if not ultimately, justified exactly by the attempt at erasing the people, the Nazi genocide against the Jews in Europe, which brings into Israeli political culture an almost unquestioned identification between the state and the people. So if, again, to give some very uncommitted example, but when Israeli leaders speak to the Iranian people and saying to them, we want the erasure of your regime, not in any way to hurt you, the Israelis are unable to hear similar comments coming from Iran to Israel, because in Israeli political culture, the erasure of the regime is the erasure of the people. With no Israel as a Jewish nation state, there will be no Jews. That's the political imaginary of this post-traumatic situation. And then immediately the question that I want to ask is it post-traumatic? Or is it just plain out traumatic exercise of sovereignty? The trauma is living. The trauma is ever present. It is sustained. I'm thinking mostly of trauma in the terms of Jeffrey Alexander's idea of a construction of an imaginary that has to be sustained, and the state is the agent that sustains it more than anyone else, through the educational system, through its various other institutions of propagating a political culture. So I would just say, I guess, as a to conclude this reference immediately to this very insightful, very intriguing idea of sovereignty that is defined by the fear of erasure, with just encouraging us to think about this nexus of regime, state, nation, sovereign, and people. is not necessarily similar. This has to do with what sovereignty in the modern sovereign, right? The post-Westphalian, the Hobbesian sovereign has been telling its nation that it is them, that sovereign is sovereign because the people have willed it to be. Well, that's an obvious, a myth that is essential for its creation. And speaking back to nation statism might encourage us to try and break apart this identification and to think of the possibilities that open there. Now, when it comes to Israeli nation statehood or Israeli political culture's fear of erasure, as Catherine mentioned, this is it's an interesting history. The previous erasure is of something completely different, of what Josephus has famously called theocracy, built around a temple that signifies not just self-rule, but also a specific relation to God. And the Jewish history, as it is told by the national narrative of Zionism, obviously ties the first temple and the second temple to what commentators love to call the third temple. Often in Israel, you would hear time and again warnings against this or that policy, which the commentator obviously object to, with the warning this will bring about the destruction of the third temple. And that's a very fascinating discursive exercise for two reasons, at least. One, it immediately gives the lie of this secular nationality. There's nothing secular in the statehood, in the sovereignty that sees itself as a reincarnation of a divine polity. And this is not an Israeli idiosyncrasy. The sovereign of modern nationalism is exactly the divine that creates itself and then tell the people, I'm expressing your will. Israel is only unique in the sense that it plays a Jewish script for this, or a Jewish interpretation, I'm sorry, for this script. The second interesting aspect of this constant comparison to the previous erasure, to the previous to the last erasure, with the fear of it returning, right, with the third temple, is the idea of statehood, of political reality that is constantly living the fear of being erased again. So the precedents are there. The first temple, or the first polity surrounding the first temple, has been destructed, and the Jewish people have been mourning it for millennia. The second temple has been destructed, and this brought about the onset of what we decry as the exile and the catastrophe that comes with it. And the idea that you now reconstruct self-rule, reconstruct a regime that is an expression of the popular will to self-determination, that is ever frightened from the possibility of erasure, brings about a specific approach to politics that may seem not healthy in some situations. Nothing is small politics. Everything can end up with the destruction of the third temple. And again, when you follow that kind of discourse, it's interesting to see how every mundane political decision can become such a frightening threat. Now, it is one obvious lesson that is drawn from that view, or that is drawn from the traumatic experience of fearing erasure constantly, is what I would call a very East European lesson of self-reliance. No one's going to help you. No one's going to save you. You have to do it for yourself. So with all the nice approaches to the West after '89, for example, right? We hear more and more from the East and Central European countries this sense that we have to rely on ourselves. And Israelis, have always been telling themselves that this lesson. The world accepts the strong. The world respects the strong. The world that wouldn't go out of his way to help the weak, even if it feels bad for them. When it comes to Israeli approaches, or how would I say, management of the Ukraine war, Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war that ensued, history and politics are entangled as they are in many aspects of Israeli political culture. And each of them in itself, history in itself and politics in itself, are obviously confused and complicated. So to give just a few highlights of what this means. Historically thinking, one obvious way to appreciate Israeli nationhood generally is to see it as a Russian product. A product conducted, managed, and dominated by people coming from the Russian Empire, influenced by their experience of the Russian Empire at the time. It's common to speak of home and diaspora in the Israeli and Jewish case, where Israel is home and diaspora is everywhere else. So Jews of diaspora, right? Jews who live in England, Jews of diaspora. The fact of Israeli nation statehood is that it is a nation state of diasporas. It is nation statehood that begins in, well, before 48, but obviously with the onset of statehood, as an amalgamation of different diasporas coming with their political cultures, with its histories, with their view of the world. And the one diaspora that has dominated the shaping of Israeli polity has been what we would call Russian, but Russian in the very expensive sense of the Russian Empire, where the distinction between Russian and Ukrainian becomes a little bit blurred. Odessa, for example, is a major city in Zionist history. So much of Zionist thinking and Zionist politicking has taken place in Odessa because the specific history of Odessa and of the Russian treatment of Jews, which pushed them to the Pale of Settlements and then to cities like Odessa. And if you ask me as a student very, very long time ago in Israeli high school, where is Odessa? I would tell you in Russia, because it's the Russian Empire where it comes from. We speak of many Russian Jews who have been prominent in the history of communism, but we don't stop to think whom of them came from Ukraine or not. And this is complicated by a very idiosyncratic Israeli and Jewish tendency to look at things from the question of, so how does this benefit the Jews? Or how did these people treat the Jews? I think early on after the February 2022, the BBC interviewed some Israelis on the street, this proverbial men from the street, about the reactions in Israel to the war, which have been again complicated by also politics, which I'll get to in a second. And the respondents, the interviewees, again, a guy from the street, if I remember correctly, his name would suggest he came from North Africa, said, do I have to worry about Ukrainians? No. Ukrainians have collaborated with the Nazis in murdering my family. This is not a surprising sentiment if you think about it from the point of view of seeing statehood as shaped by the trauma of the Holocaust, and then seeing history as a very specific narrative of Jewish persecution culminating with the Holocaust and then justifying statehood. So much for historical perspective. Politically speaking, it's important to remember that when Russia invades Ukraine, it also has a very strong military presence in Syria, just at the border with Israel. This is Assad Syria. This is before December of last year. Russia is closely aligned with Iran, and more so since the outbreak of war, which Israel sees as its most important adversary. And as far as I know, and I apologize if this is a mistake, but as far as I know, the largest Russian-speaking community outside of Russia is still in Israel. So when the war breaks out, and all international organizations and almost unanimously around the world, there's an attempt at sanctions and boycott Russia, Israel stays aside. Tel Aviv is still one of the only routes directly flying to Moscow. Bank relations with Russia have not been severed like they have been elsewhere, with the very practical reason that many Israelis have that kind of relation, that kind of ties with Russia, families, bank accounts, businesses. Since the 1990s, more than 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union have arrived in Israel, which has already had a very large portion of Russia's population. So all of this goes to say that there is no one obvious answer. What is the Israeli approach to the war in Ukraine? And the complications and nuances are only enriching this picture. Thank you.